I want to tell you this story. I hope you don't make fun of it because I'm a little embarrassed to do it. Only a few members of my family know about it. I haven't told my friends about it for fear that they'll make fun of me or tell me I'm crazy, but I think this community is the right place to do it. It's not Halloween exactly, but it happened in a week between the end of October and the Day of the Dead. In San Diego, California, since I was a kid, but every year we go to visit our family. At least twice a year. On one of those visits my dad had an emergency from work and he couldn't go. Although we already had everything ready, my mother stayed with him, but they gave my sister and me the opportunity to go. It was the first time we were traveling alone. We were teenagers and an aunt picked us up at the airport with her son, and she took us to our grandmother's house. An old house that had been in her family for generations, too big for them, and the yard was huge, so big that she could have built a house there for each of her children, but no one accepted that offer. My grandmother received us with great joy and my aunt left my cousin with us. He was 14 years old, only a little older than me. I remember my grandmother went to the kitchen to prepare dinner for us, and my sister, who always liked to help, began to chop vegetables and that kind of thing. My cousin and I preferred to go play in the patio. It began to get dark and she sat with me on one of the swings that hung from a huge tree. On the biggest swing in the patio we get tangled up, let's get loose and spin, and from suddenly one of my ropes came loose and I fell. We laughed a lot because I fell headlong, but when the laughter passed we heard as if something was laughing from the top of the tree. I looked towards the branch that the swings were holding. There was something there that I could no longer distinguish in the dark. My cousin's face had changed. I looked at him and his eyes were wide open. He helped me get up and we quickly went into the kitchen. While my sister told me what she made for food, I saw that my cousin approached the grandma and said something in her ear. She answered something that I couldn't hear, and the only thing I could hear was, "You stay with them," and my cousin nodded. A while later we went to sleep. My cousin slept next to the window, then my sister, in another small bed. I don't know if this is part of a dream, but at night, I don't know what time in the morning, a sound in the window woke me up. I tried to open my eyes and focus my gaze, and there was something in the window, a small silhouette with my hands around my face as if trying to see inside. I spoke to my cousin and he only answered me to go back to sleep. I could see how the silhouette turned towards him when he spoke. The next day my cousin acted completely calm. Another uncle also arrived with his family and left late. Nothing happened, but the next day, a Saturday, with more family, suddenly I heard the cry of my sister and two other cousins her age. I approached them and asked them what was happening here. They pointed to a hole like a squirrel in a pile of dirt at the back of the patio. They said, "Whoever got in asked them," the man said. A small man told them with his little hand to follow him and he got in. They kept shouting. They are excited. I asked them to go to the house because the grandmother was talking to them. I got very angry. I don't know what was going through my head. I didn't know if it was his imagination or it was what I had seen at night, but I went for a hose without telling anyone and I put it in the hole they had indicated. I opened it. I went completely and I left it for a while so that it filled with water. When my cousin realized it, he closed it without saying anything. We went to sleep at his house and the grandmother was left alone. When we returned on Sunday, the grandmother cleaned and collected things in the garden. There were really several broken things, pots lying around. I thought it had been from the games of the day before, perhaps too many children in the patio, but then I saw the window of the room where we were staying and it was broken. Around there were many mud marks like little feet. I can't sure, but I had the impression that our suitcases had been moved. I don't remember if something was missing that day. We spent our time playing Mario Kart inside. At a certain point I got up to the bathroom and saw that my grandmother was heading towards the end of the patio, in the direction of the hole that I filled with water. I could swear that she had something in her hands, a plate perhaps, but I didn't ask her. We slept in another room and nothing happened. The following days my cousin didn't stay anymore because he had to go to school, but we spent them in complete peace of mind. My grandma died years after that visit we made to her. It was a pretty strong episode and difficult for everyone to go through. The whole family went to the funeral. I hadn't seen my cousins for years that I haven't seen since then. my cousin who mentioned his mother were the closest people to Grandma. We found out that they would stay in the house for a while, perhaps a few years, until an agreement was reached whether to remodel it or if it would finally be sold. It should be clarified here that this day it was not my grandmother's daughter but her daughter-in-law, her husband, my uncle Nestor. The eldest son died in an accident when my cousin was about 5 years old. None of the children had the intention of staying in the house. My sister and I have always felt more confident with the family. I asked permission to stay with them the days we were there together. On that occasion, especially at night, staying up until very late talking. I think I got to know my grandmother more through the words of my aunt than my cousin. However, in the last months of my grandmother's life they had also distanced themselves a bit. Everyone was always aware of her grandmother's fondness for reading and especially about the supernatural. The grandmother was Catholic, but that did not prevent her from knowing about these phenomena, about mythology, legends and other cultures. The children of the family always mentioned encounters with these beings in my grandmother's house, but they were never taken seriously by the adults. My aunt suggested that perhaps something happened in that house when my uncles were little and lived there. To this day none of them enter the place alone. The grandmother was perhaps not very open about it with the others of course, but she did not hide that there was something strange there either. They got to see her in the patio, apparently alone, sneaking sweets into dark corners of the garden at night. It is curious and it is perhaps an insignificant detail, but I want to mention it, because we found 2 photos from when the grandmother was a child, perhaps at her birthday party or something similar, and they were in that courtyard, a courtyard that seems to have frozen in time, contrary to what happens behind its enormous walls in a street that has completely changed. In these photos taken in the corner of the courtyard the grandmother appeared in the company of other children. I don't know if they were family or friends. The curious thing is that the grandmother appears smiling and happy while the children appear with serious, almost macabre faces, and that is only in these 2 photos. Other photos where you can see the garden, the children appear happy as at any party. But going back to the topic, my cousin was more honest about it when he talked about things about my grandmother. When his mother was not around, what his grandmother told him was so strange that not even my aunt could fully accept it. He told me that my grandmother did talk to him about her garden friends, beings who accompanied her throughout her childhood and part of her youth, even though she had forgotten them when the girl had names for everyone. She grew up and left to live in another city, when she married her grandfather but eventually returned home. When her parents died and somehow she had forgotten about these friends. But they came back when my uncle Nestor was born. My grandmother thinks that perhaps they came back to be my uncle's friends. My father and his brothers as children did not accept that friendship, as far as we know, and eventually these beings stopped appearing, listening to each other at night, moving things in the yard. Many years later when my grandmother was already an old woman, it is supposed that one of them returned, perhaps the one who entered our room. However, there was never a serious incident. None of my cousins had any traumatic experience. Approximately a year before his death, one afternoon my cousin was helping my grandmother with her rose bushes, and it was almost dark for them working in the garden. Suddenly my grandmother told her to stay quiet for a moment and asked her not to look back. My cousin accepted, wondering what it was about, something bad. They entered the house a few minutes later and my grandmother told her that the garden had been filled with them. More of the ones they never saw, but this time they had a terrifying, threatening aspect. The grandmother looked scared and my cousin told her mom. She thought that the most prudent thing would be to discuss it with the grandmother's relatives. They decided to attribute it to dementia. They even tried to convince my grandmother to enter a nursing home. She got upset with everyone, even my cousin, for telling it, even though she didn't receive them the same anymore. My aunt and cousin went to visit her at least once a month to see how she was. One of those last occasions before entering the house they heard a commotion, as if there was a meeting inside, things moving, conversations and voices. When they opened the door there was only silence, the lights were off and the grandmother alone, in her room. They found her alone and quiet on each visit. The day she died, it was something strange. They found her with flowers from the garden and in her hair. According to the forensics, she had died the night before, but my aunt swears that the flowers seemed fresh cut. My cousin showed me a letter that my grandmother left him and thanked him for all the care he had always had, for being the closest to her, for being a partner who cared more than any of his children did. The letter ends with this sentence: "You have to know that some humans are afraid of what they don't know." My cousin cannot be sure what he is referring to, but he thinks he was not talking about his children. I once tried to talk about this with my father to find out more, perhaps to ask him about his childhood in that house, but he only limited himself to saying that the grandmother was wrong, and that is what everyone does, attributing everything to the age of the grandmother, to her fondness for fantasy. I know that this story does not have much horror, supernatural or paranormal, but it will be exposed and published on her YouTube channel what my grandmother experienced. Thanks for reading and listening to my story.